I just wanted to say, when you see Gad or Prince,
Yes?
we have found that those records are directly related to Pierce's concert, and that sometimes is his name that is used. We believe that because he was able to own land before, for that matter, African Americans or women were allowed to own land, that there was a secret deal that was done for him to purchase the homestead in Southampton. So there are records in the Southampton Presbyterian Church that shows these different names listed simultaneously. William Prince, Prince Gad, and vice versa. So those records are in the Southampton Presbyterian Records, Volume 4, I believe.
It's on? Okay. Yeah, I was just working from what knowledge I had of Native Americans, and as I said, this is preliminary. We've only been at this since December, and it's been there's a lot to go. We have all of Cooper, or we don't have. I don't know that we have all, but we have an enormous amount of material from his household: bills for food, false teeth for his wife, a piano, photo. I mean, it's as I said, there's almost 4,000 documents there, so it's anywhere from business accounts from his agents down to scraps of paper from local people. One of the other things that you might find interesting is that he was getting bills from local people as late as 1852 in pounds, shillings, and pence. Okay, I never expected to see them that late. And most of them, or many of them, were cottage industry for nail making. The tradition of the cottage industry of making nails in England apparently transferred over here, and people were producing nails. So there's you know, as I said, I just kind of skimmed the surface here.
Hi, I have a question for Allison McGovern, and very interesting papers, and yours, this is a question out of ignorance. I'm kind of curious, in your analysis, aside from the 1806 census, it seems that you had relatively little assurance that the wife, I'm sorry, I don't remember her name, was the only...
Alusa Tallman.
Alusa.
Also, she's also identified as Lois Tallman in some of the documents.
Okay, well, is this a matrilineal society? I mean, is there any suggestion that there would be a larger number of people in the household, or that she would be joined by other relatives in the household? Because it seemed to me that you were suggesting this was a nuclear family, that in the absence of Jeremiah, that she was largely living alone, especially after the death of the son. There's no hint of servants necessarily, so I'm really kind of curious about the context and the family relationships that might complicate who's in the household.
Sure. There's really only one document that gives an indication to the occupants of the household, and that's the 1806 census. And it actually does list the number of people in households at Indian Fields. So it's really hard to say at any point if there were more or less people in the household with her, but I don't think she was alone. I think there was a larger community there at Indian Fields, and then people worked together, you know, under various circumstances. Does that help?
Thank you all. I appreciate all the information you shared with us today. I have a question for Mr. Strong that actually came to mind during Mr. Turano's presentation. You had mentioned initially that the harpooner gave way to the steersman for rank and honor to kill the whale, the right whale finally, and suggested that they had to move about the boat to accomplish that.
Yeah.
And it dawned on me the possibility that the boat either being past the exhausted whale, so the steersman had access, or given the oarsmen's talents that they could turn this symmetrical boat, whaling ship at any point to get access so the steersman could take his final shot.
I don't know, we.
Is the
never-
documentation that they actually physically moved about the boat? That's, I didn't understand that part of your presentation,
Okay.
or if that's just how they position the final kill.
Now, the tradition of the harpooner exchanging places with the boat steerer continued right down through the end of the 19th century.
Yeah.
Even when Robert Cushman Murphy sails on the Daisy, he describes the same situation. So it was the tradition.
They physically maneuvered to accomplish
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
Ill-advised.
Yeah, the other thing that you see frequently, and in the beginning I just couldn't believe it, but they would, the whaleboats had a sail that they could step, and more often than not, when they approached the whale, they still had the sail up, which
Yeah.
I couldn't, that sounded
Crazy.
a little crazy. But and the other thing I always think that it was very good that the oarsmen had their back to the harpooner, so they couldn't quite see what was going on.
That's an interesting aspect of this in terms of the difference between a canoe and a whaleboat. The Indians were used to being in a canoe where they could see where they were going. Psychologically and cognitively and so forth, there's a process. Then you hire them to turn around backwards and go. And I often wondered about that transition.
Yeah.
Because it's stark in a sense. They had to really have confidence in the steersman to get them in the right place. Anyway.
Thank you all for your presentations. I do have a kind of a peripheral question that's of interest to me. Have any of you come across evidence of freedom-seeking people working or escaping Long Island, the east end of Long Island, through the maritime and whaling industry before or after the 1850 fugitive slave law? Been trying to find evidence.
I haven't, but
No, I haven't.
No, I don't have
I had a very difficult time tracing even local African Americans aboard ships who on the ship's log stated they were born in Cold Spring Harbor and that they currently lived in Cold Spring Harbor. So it's not surprising to me that it's difficult information to find.
I think I have a simple question. It's for Jenna. The Jones brothers of Cold Spring Harbor, any relation to the Joneses of the Jones Beach Joneses?
Okay, I haven't personally pursued this, but a number of family genealogies suggest that it is an off branch, but I didn't verify that, so I don't know.
Just a second, John, can I have that
oh,
mic too?
yeah.
John and I have had this discussion before about Native American whaling and what did they pursue. And I think we agree to sort of disagree. But one of the whales, the pilot whales, were very common along the northeast coast. And I believe that was the primary target of Native American whaling, because the pilot whales traveled in large pods and tend to come close to shore. They'd be in the vicinity up to about 20 feet long. So it would be something that would easily be within their technology to take. And when it's described that the Native Americans went whaling, I'm kind of suspicious that that's what they were pursuing.
Yeah. I must say, I don't really have a strong position on this, but I think that certainly during the whaling period, the commercial whaling, it was pretty clear that in the early shore whaling that they were going after the smaller right whales. The question about whaling before the Europeans arrived is one that's been discussed at great length. There is some interesting references to the Norse who hunted whales by herding them into the fjords and then killing them with spears and bows and arrows and so forth, and that the Basque learned from the Norse, and then, and so it's possible that this would speak to what Frank's position, that it might be that the Indians were actually herding, the pilot whales are there, herding them in where they shove the shallower waters, or other fish as well, other large fish. Anyway, that's.
Frank, in the Cooper records document, is there any indication of the construction materials and type of boats are built, such as clinker or other styles?
Yeah, Cooper, there are a couple of things that are interesting. One of them, I happen to be a wood person, which some people here share that obsession. But anyway, Cooper, almost everything that Cooper was buying cedar planking, and it was between 5/8 and 3/4 of an inch thick, so it was easily bent. He also bought the next most common thing that he purchased was oak and oak butts. There's a couple of problems in the construction, and first of all, virtually all of the ribs in the boat were steam bent, as well as the stem and stern pieces. So that would have been the method of shaping the boat. One of the problems that comes out in the records with Cooper is initially the whale boats were lap straight, where the sides were riveted together. The whalers found that they made too much noise, and so they shifted over to what they called smooth boats, where the joints were butted and there was a batten inside. There is a whaleboat that is attributed to Cooper. We saw a picture of it, and it's at the Sag Harbor Whaling Museum, and I suspect that's in the class of the Lincoln axe in my family for the last 150 years. We keep using it, and we've changed the handle 3 times and the head twice. So this thing has been rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt, and it's kind of hard to figure out what really it was like. I think that someone more knowledgeable than myself can sit down with what few construction records and comments that we have and figure out exactly what he was doing. But it looks like he was knocking out with 2 helpers, or 2 journeymen and the 2 apprentices. He was knocking out a boat in a week. Oh, by the way, the other thing is that whale boats were by and large considered expendable. They were the price of a voyage. So ships would come in and get 5 more boats, 3 primaries and 2 backups. And in the 1840s, you could purchase a fully equipped whaleboat for about $60. A used whaleboat, Cooper bought 2 used whaleboats, cost him $7. Okay, so they were very much, expendable.
Stephen, your question?
Yeah, I just want to comment about the whale boats. They did in fact change. Melville and Moby Dick has a whole chapter on it. And he talks about it as being tradition. He also says it's crazy. How they could do it is, remember that these were men in their teens and 20s, and they were exceptional athletes.
They must have been.
To do what they did. The other thing is with the harpooner, be he an Anglo-American, Eastern Long Islander, Native American, African American. And that's something interesting too, is that unlike the New England ports, Sag Harbor remains manned by Eastern Long Islanders, people from Brookhaven East. You don't see a lot of people coming down from New England. But regarding the whaleboat and the amazing abilities of these men in these incredibly integrated boats, where the boat steerer may be an African American or a Native American, outranking the son of the biggest landowner of East Hampton, who's a green hand, the harpooner had to row. He might be rowing for 3 hours, and then he had to throw the harp. These guys are just incredible athletes.
Stephen, on that reversal, one of the things that was done is once the whale was harpooned, the oarsman would then back away from the whale. It's not a matter of them rotating the boat 180 degrees. They would back away so that they didn't get slapped by the tail. Okay, that was basically, and that was the advantage of having a double ender, was that you could reverse it and get out of there.
David has a comment.
Just had a couple comments. The harpoon was tied off at the bow, so.
No,
No.
no. The line for the harpoon ran down the length of the boat, around a loggerhead at the back, and then from there into usually 2 tubs of line, so that the line was played out down the length of the boat. The interesting thing is that right at the bow, where the line went through, there was a peg that wasn't even as big as a pencil that held the line in place, so that if the whale submerged and came up behind them, that peg would break and the line would then be taken from the back of the boat.
Nothing makes any sense in these weapons at all. It's crazy. It's like a hummingbird shouldn't fly, you know.
The other comment was, maybe the sails were used to get closer because they were quieter. And also the idea about getting pilot whales, they often beach themselves.
Right.
So it'd be easier to get a whole bunch of them.
Yeah, the sail, many times, you know, they would go out looking for the whale, and they could be 2, 3, 4 miles from the whale ship, and that was where the sail played in.
Yeah.
The other thing that I have to throw out is that we know about the shore whaling, and when I was first researching this, you know, John will attest. I'm reading accounts of these men going out, and the whaling season here on Long Island was January, February, and March. What a great time to go to the beach, okay? And then, you know, they're launching their boats in the surf.
Yeah.
And I'm saying, why were there any survivors? You know, and then what happened, on one account, a bizarre account, one of the men from Southampton had the habit of as soon as the boat was launched, he would stick his mittens in the water and grab the oar. And I said, that's the key. Everything that they wore was made out of homespun wool, which was high in lanolin. And by putting his mittens in the water beat it up in the spaces in the wool, and he was now wearing a wet glove. And so that was why they were able to survive that.
Yeah, it's like a wetsuit that he kept
Exactly,
it in.
exactly. Kept the water inside,
And it's
it was
warm.
warm.
The body warmed it. Yeah.
Okay, John, I got a question for you.
Wait, let's hear David, because he's
I
been
just had a
waiting, and then we'll come.
question for Allison about the house of Jeremiah's house.
Yes.
Was it a English-style house or was it a wigwam style?
It seems to be a blend of wigwam and English building practices. So it's
When
sort
did
of,
it date from, did you say?
roughly, well, somewhere after 1750, so 1760-ish, and into the early 1800s, around 1830 is when we don't see anybody living there anymore. And so what I did with my dissertation is I compared it to similar examples of building traditions in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and so it's definitely, it's not a specific architectural type, but it's a vernacular architecture that appears in the 1700s and the early 1800s, where these architectural features associated with wigwams are also blended with like a window, a glass window, or a wall, or
Because we have direct comments from elders who recollect 1840s and 50s period of still being using the wigwams at that time. So.
Well, I would be very much interested in.
Yeah, it's
finding
right.
out.
It's Rebecca Von Kellis,
Okay.
for example. She was 99 and interviewed in 1836 and talked about going with her grandmother to visit
You see,
relatives living in those.
that's one of the things that I was interested in at Indian Fields, because there's 3 household structures that all date to between roughly 1750 and 1885. And one of the more recent ones that was inhabited by the Fowler family, 1840 to 1885, is a very English style, square house, square footprint, which is very different to the Farrow house. So.
Frank had a question.
Well-
We're gonna.
Useless-
We're gonna get another
Okay, go
question,
ahead.
Sally.
For Jenna, would you say something about the African American whalers? You said it's somewhat elusive, but
For the Cold Spring Harbor Whaling Company, you always see the 1841 ship's log from the Tuscarora, which clearly states people whose physical description put them in the category of interpreting them as African Americans. And about half of those say they're born in Cold Spring Harbor, and a smaller number say they still reside in Cold Spring Harbor. And then there's some additional folks who weren't born in Cold Spring Harbor, state they were born someplace else, but now currently reside in Cold Spring Harbor. They're not in the 1830 census, they're not in the 1840 census, they're not in the 1850 census. Now the 30 and 40, obviously these could be individuals with different last names within households that have heads that have a different last name. So those are more difficult folks to trace. But in Bolster's work on African American sailors, he finds the same thing in both Philadelphia and Baltimore. I think in Baltimore he has a sample of 233 long, offshore sailors, and only 4% of them show up in the city records. His suggestion is that at that juncture, that whaling isn't really conducive to maintaining a stable household. I didn't really find any evidence to support that, and I actually feel that it might be something more closely linked to the mobility of the labor force or the labor market for African Americans in general at that time, people having the ability to move around. And until we understand the connections between families across the larger landscape, that I don't think that these people are really going to show up on, using the research methods that we're currently using. It's time consuming. You have to really cast a wide net. I did find some households right at the start of the, between 1830 and 1840, right at the start of the Cold Spring Harbor Whaling Company, that had really substantial structural changes where it looked like maybe a young woman and several additional children moved into another household. So it could be that some of the local communities are reorganizing to create those support systems, like someone asked regarding the Farrow site. But it's still a ways off from making those connections securely.
Okay, this was a comment about placing, the rope on the stern of the whaleboat. If you pull on the bow of a wooden boat, you'll pull the boat apart if you apply the forces. So what you do is you put that rope on the stern of the boat and you push the boat. Now you have to control that rope or that line so the bow doesn't wiggle all over the place, but you want most of the force to be on the stern of the boat to compress the boat, to keep it together, rather than on the bow of the boat, which would tear it apart.
Frank, you had a question.
One of the things that some people are aware of is that there were an enormous number of Middle English terms used on eastern Long Island well into the 20th century. And I can remember one instance where I had a group of students and were interviewing a woman on a farm, and she started using some of these. But we all know what a hedgel is, right? That's what they comb the wool out with. Well, I was being quizzed by a longtime East Ender when I was doing the farm film, and he looked at me and he said, "Do you know what a setchel is?" And I said, I have no idea. And it turns out that the setchel is a trough between specific waves into which you launch a whaleboat from the beach. So there was a term for it.
Next question.
I have a question for Jenna. You had mentioned that the Jones brothers had difficulty finding experienced captains. What was the reason for that? Or what were the reasons, I should say?
Well, they entered the market in 1838. At that point, it was pretty much a saturated market. So they were starting with no experience in an overcrowded market space with Sag Harbor right up the road, which was a long-established whaling port with long-established relationships and companies. So most of the local folks were there. They were already spoken for. That was a primary issue, but they also had trouble not just finding captains. They had trouble finding just outfitting their crews in general. They signed people on in New York City. They signed people on in Cold Spring Harbor. They signed people on, as many crews did in the Sandwich Islands. And you see a number of folks from that part of the world who sail with the Cold Spring Harbor Whaling Company on company ships and on other voyages, on more traditional voyages, again and again and again. Whether or not George A. Kanaka is the same George A. Kanaka on the 44 Monmouth and, a later ship is another question.
So something to add to your thing. William Cooper built whaleboats for every whale ship that sailed out of Sag Harbor. Virtually every whaleboat that sailed from Long Island and parts of Connecticut. And he also built whaleboats for Cold Spring Harbor.
I know, you gave me the references last time I saw you.
I might add another couple of comments on the discussion that Frank and I have been having about prehistoric Indian whaling. And that's that we know in the Northwest it was done. And we also know, though, that north of here on the Atlantic coast, Indians were hunting some whales. We know because one of the important mechanisms you need is a kind of a toggle hook so that the harpoon goes in and then it won't come out. And they found an archaeological example of a bone toggle hook off Newfoundland in that area. Also, I should note that the Basque were always complaining because the Indians were stealing their harpooning tools, suggesting that they were using them, they found them better than what they had been using themselves. So there is some evidence that there was some activity. We don't know much in detail about it, but also the fact that you have that mica tablet suggests there was something important, a relationship between the native peoples here on Long Island and the whale and the whale spirit.
Susan, next question.
Thank you very much to the whole panel. I'm here as a literature professor, not a historian, and I've learned so much. I regularly teach Moby Dick, and one of the questions that came up, especially during your presentation, Jenna, about the economic structure of the whaling industry changing with the passage of the 1838 incorporation law, and those were part of this venture, shifting from subscribers to shareholders. That shift, it seems to me, might help me to understand kind of some of the nuances of one of the metaphors that Melville uses for the interconnection of humanity is the statement, we're all a joint stock company. And that term of joint stock companies, I know in England there were huge debates and a kind of panic about the shift toward joint stock companies, their legality, the kind of risk, the kind of change it represented in the relationship between economics and social strata. Since you have traced the particular shift around the law in America, in this country, could you tell me a little bit more about whether the term joint stock company was applied only after the law of incorporation? If it applied to the earlier arrangements, that would help to understand the model of interconnection that Melville is evoking.
There isn't
Use the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm usually loud enough, but I'm a little worse for wear. There isn't a specific 1838 law of incorporation. The laws affecting the ability to incorporate first start out in the banking industry, and then there's a big recoil because of a whole host of things that go horribly wrong, including people's fear of monopolies and money, and the shifting issues of currency and the lack of availability of currency, and excuse me, as well as all the surrounding panics. The incorporation laws that affected different parts of the different economic sectors changed over time. The ones that specifically allowed whaling, are after the banks, but are certainly in place by 1820. They're modeled after laws that go in around 1820 that kind of structure all incorporation laws after that for manufacturing, for canal building, for steamship boat operation. And then in the 1830s, there's this huge boom of whaling companies taking this on. And it is a bit of a mishmash, but each and every incorporation is an act of state legislation. So that may be where that came in. So when the Staten Island Whaling Company wanted to incorporate, they had to go before the state legislature, as well as the Cold Spring Harbor Whaling Company. The legislature discussed it. It often went to subcommittee. This Cold Spring Harbor, bill went to subcommittee twice. The Staten Island venture had very little trouble getting through. Maybe it should have been the other way around, but there may have been some concern because Walter Restored Jones was actually the head of the Atlantic Marine Insurance Company, both the first, which had been dissolved, and the second, which was later transformed into the Atlantic Mutual Company and was actually still in operation until 2011. They insured the Titanic.
Sorry about that.
So they may have, exactly, they may have been concerned about his involvement in the insurance business, and so that act took a little bit more consideration than maybe the Staten Island one did. So each one of these entities went through kind of their own accord and were shepherded by whatever cronies they could pull together to help get them through.
Okay, we have time, I think, for one more question.
Try and get a comment.
Let me throw out one more comment. One of the things that I don't believe is generally known, but when someone bought a share in a whaling voyage, okay, they obviously got a proportion of the catch, okay, as a reward. But also, they were in the Cooper papers. There are a number of what they call calls on the shares, and what that was that as a shareholder, you had to kick in money to finance the next voyage. So it wasn't always all gravy, and that may be that.
And in the cases that he's talking about, a lot of the terminology between traditional ventures and what we think of as modern corporations, in the whaling business, they overlap. So you talk about a whaling company, and what you're talking about could be something that was occurring, in 1670, and your investors or stockholders, what they get back is a percentage of the leg. In an actual incorporated business, like what the Cold Spring Harbor Whaling Company became with the Tuscarora and the Monmouth as their company ships, was something different. Now, because they kept doing this other, more traditional organization alongside, it kind of all gets mixed in together. But it's part of the reason I think they were so successful in the end. They hedged themselves against some kind of risk that they saw in the market space, and they also tried to negotiate. Who the heck can get 50 people in a room to say that this is how we're going to do it?
Okay, last question?
Yes, it's not really a question, it's kind of a couple of comments. But not Allison, Jenna, when you get the chance, one day we'll have to have lunch together.
I love lunch.
I have 2 years' worth of research on the Cold Spring Harbor Company. And one is, they're descendants of a very wealthy family, the Floyd Jones. And that was the family asked if people park. That's
Right.
just one thing. And the other thing was, I wrote them down, we had at least 5 famous captains that actually sailed for Cold Spring Harbor. The 5 I'm talking about included Captain Henry Green, who was the head captain of 18 captains that took a ship from the Sabrina from Southampton and went out and tried gold mining. And, yeah, the 1849. And that's the same one that John Hillis, he died out there.
I don't recall his name from the Cold Spring Harbor captain list.
Yes, he is. And another thing is that when you're talking about people back during that time, you can't refer to them as African Americans because that was not a term used. It wasn't on their seaman protection certificates or anything like that. It was the seaman protection certificates gave the color of a person's skin. It did not mention whether, once in a while they mentioned Indian or something like that, but in a lot of the cases, it just mentioned the color of the skin. So you can't refer to African Americans who term used today.
Yes, I agree with that, and I've struggled with that terminology a bit, and one of the ways that one of the reasons that I've landed in this place, and Georgette, I see your arm, is that Georgette? I see your arm and I would be grateful for any contribution, is because I'm trying to align the data with the census records. And so it's aligning it with free Black households.
Okay, I would wait to address it during my presentation, but African Americans' names have changed from some derogatory terms, from Negro, color, woolly, darky, and all these different terms. But in today's time, and being politically correct, and not only that, me actually identifying myself with African American, this can be interchangeable. So I do not agree with the comment that you cannot say it. Technically, you have to call it what it is. Back then, they did not have it listed as, you can say what it is, but if you feel more comfortable with identifying as, now that's politically correct, but it is technically right that it was not African American back then. And then the other thing is the color of your skin, which was also, and if you look at Cash's article from Long Island History Journal, she says that in the records, this color of skin sometimes will be misassigned to not only just the Native Americans, but the people from Cape Verde and various places. So for us, in terms of research and what we're trying to do is to be able to wade through many of these. So just purely looking at color of skin, which was also very confusing when we were doing research, because it was not just for African American, well, what we consider today African Americans or Blacks or Negroes, or Native Americans or Indians. It was used for various populations of people. So the color of the skin is really an issue, and of course we always have to talk about that, but it cannot be just said that it's black or white, because Cape Verde, many of the other Spanish, different people, depending on your color of skin, they will all be classified as black, and we know that that's not true.
And there are a lot of sailors from around the world that are particularly on the Cold Spring Harbor ship logs that we see again and again. So it's a very poignant perspective for this particular company as well.
Okay, we're going to end with one last comment, and then before you disappear, I have just a few housekeeping announcements.
So these comments, as well as the emphasis on household production, workshop production, connections to the larger regional, even Atlantic markets. I wanted to encourage, maybe in the afternoon sessions, to think a little bit about not just the uniqueness of Long Island, but then think also about the ways in which many of the trends in Long Island echo or are part of a larger regional or national or even international story, because I think you have, global story. Okay, sorry. Okay.
We'll be going global after lunch, not to worry. And we will reconvene here at 2 o'clock, and I would like to first thank our speakers, and then Stephen's going to take us out with a tune.